All right, so a little commercial break for you there. Time to get a cup of coffee or use the restroom. Right? So Europeans are developing knowledge of wind patterns. And again, Columbus kind of gets lucky. He leaves Spain, and we have these westerly winds that do this pattern here. We can bring him into the Caribbean and home again. All right? So some of what Columbus did was just contingency or just kind of fate or luck. With Columbus, we have something named after him, the Columbian Exchange, especially epidemic disease. Right? So we're dealing with this coronavirus thing right now. It's bad, but it's nothing like smallpox. Right? Smallpox was a disease that had afflicted Europeans, Africans, and Asians. Right? They're all in contact with one another for thousands of years. And typically, a child, a toddler, would get smallpox and survive or not. Okay, just kind of tough to say because I have a 3-year-old daughter. I can't imagine her getting sick and not surviving. But, you know, if you survive smallpox, you might be scarred a little bit, but you're from kind of the pox, right, the pustules. But you're not really going to get it again. When a 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old die, it's heartbreaking, especially to our era that sees children differently than folks did 500 years ago in Europe. But it doesn't destroy your society, right? These aren't the so-called breadwinners. They're not the rulers. They're not the elders of a society that have the knowledge. They're not the parents who provide for the children, right? So the Europeans have acquired immunity to smallpox. And so did African people and people of Asia, right? So when they come across the Atlantic, they encounter kind of a virgin soil, meaning the native people their bodies had never experienced that pathogen before. So when it hits the native people, it's going to afflict 3, 4, 5-year-olds, but also 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds who are running society. So the impact is devastating. And the mortality rate estimated to be about 90%. Okay, so this is the worst Holocaust, unintentional, I should say, in human history. The population of the Western Hemisphere, we don't know exactly. We don't have the written records. But demographers estimate it's about 100 million in 1491. By 1591, it was 10 million, native population. What happened? Did 90 million people die? Hard to say. A lot of people went unborn. So when a young man and a young woman die, they don't have children. So the native population just plummets. And along with it, culture, knowledge, it's just devastating to world history. Tragically, similar scenario will unfold among the peoples, we say peoples in history, the peoples of the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, Australia, South Pacific, okay, Hawaii, will experience kind of the same reaction in the first generation. Now look, in the second generation is going to build up some immunity, right? So it hits that first generation. So don't go away from this thinking that like all the native people died and, you know, how could there be native people anymore? Those populations will slowly recover, although often through mixed parentage. Right? What we'll see is the Spanish and the Portuguese who come to the Americas, mostly just men. I mean, over 90% were men in the first few generations would, take Native American wives. That may or may not have been consensual. Right? There were certainly an untold number of rapes, violent sexual encounters. Right? And out of those, hopefully some affectionate relationships as well, children will be born of mixed parentage. Okay? Mestizo. So this exchange of pathogens is devastating for native people. Look, it could have gone the other way. What if the Spanish had gotten sick and made it back across the Atlantic and then got people in Europe sick and the European population plummeted by 90%? Those are the what-ifs of history, right? It didn't happen. It just didn't go that way. Probably a disease the Europeans brought back to Europe home when they ended up with their wives again was syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease. So those good Christians of Spain, what were they doing over in the Americas? Right? Bring back STDs. Foods were also exchanged and animals. So what ends up in the Americas? Wheat, sugar, horses, cattle. Those did not exist before 1492, and I'm not sure exactly, who knows when the first horses arrived. It wasn't with Columbus, I'm sure. So that image you have of like a native person with a horse, that's greatly a 19th century image, right? Once horses are brought to the Americas, and some escape or traded. Cattle as well. So native people actually did not have many domesticated animals. That's probably one reason for the lack of immunities they had to many diseases. Smallpox actually originated among bovine, in the sense that it originated among cows. Like the coronavirus, we think, originated with bats, transmitted to humans through an intermediary species. The theory right now, who knows when you're watching this might be on YouTube for a long time. At least the theory right now is pangolins. When I'm like, pangolins, they're kind of cute reptiles with scales. I mean, I've never, maybe in a zoo I've seen them. But, so, smallpox came from cows indirectly. So if you had enough cows in your population, you're not going to have smallpox until a human brings it to you. So one reason native people did not have a lot of immunity to some of these diseases was due to the lack of domesticated animals. So what's going to pull the plow on your farm? You, okay? You're not going to hitch it up to a buffalo or a deer or a llama or a dog or a turkey. I mean, that's basically there's probably others. You fact check me there. But that's probably, for the most part, the domesticated animals. Well, not the deer and bison were never domesticated, but cows and guinea pigs and llamas the native people had. So what went to the rest of the world? Potatoes, yellow corn called maize, and beans, also chocolate to the rest of the world. So what's going to happen? I mean, this is like iniquity on top of unfairness, right? So the native population in the Americas is plummeting through disease, but also conquest and enslavement. Look, there just has to be emotional depression as well, right? Why live, why go on, this type of thinking. In Europe, Africa, and Asia, the population is going to go up because of these new foods coming in. Corn, when consumed with beans, is nutritious, right? You have the right amino acids. Probably squash was in there. Chocolate, I guess I mentioned. Tobacco, that one, not so healthy. But these were crops that originated in the Americas. So there will be a rise in the global population, even as the native population in the Americas is plummeting. Because it didn't really happen all at once. I guess I said 1491 to 1591. It's not like the devastation due to disease stopped in 1591. It takes a while to spread, for example, to North America. So there are large numbers of Native American people dying of things like smallpox in the mid-1600s. Okay, so it takes a while for the disease to spread. And one of the, you need to consider is no one knew what caused the diseases, and if you were a native person, you would probably get sick from another native person who got sick from another native person who got sick from, down the line there's a European somewhere, but that disease is going to start to spread within native populations that never even saw a European person. So what's this, the world is ending kind of mentality. Right? Keep in mind as well, there's the greatest forced migration in history. Over 12 million enslaved human beings forcibly removed from their homeland and driven by boat, right, across the Atlantic in the really horrific Middle Passage. Okay. Why? Well, quite simply, there aren't enough Europeans to do the hard work of farming, of raising the livestock they're bringing in, and especially taking silver out of the ground in places like what's now Colombia or Venezuela. So native people will be enslaved, but if they're going to be weakened by disease, or I'm hoping running away, right? There were large numbers of runaways, enslaved people ran away, native people ran away. It was actually, in a really sick way of thinking about this, cheaper if I'm a SOB slave owner and my Native American slaves survive the disease but run away, right? They got a home field advantage. It's cheaper in some ways for me to buy a human being from Africa than to go find the enslaved people who ran away. I mean, it's a really perverted way of thinking about this. But you start to see a large influx of African peoples into especially the Portuguese colony. We talk a lot about the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Brazil, Portuguese colony, right, becomes a major sugar producing colony, much bigger than Portugal itself, obviously, mostly with African labor or African Brazilian labor. And of course, all types of cultural interminglings going on as well, right? So, you might be born in this environment and your father had come from Africa, mother was a Native American, father might have been from Europe, mother might have been African, right? So many different relationships, and again, got to say not always consensual, especially when the white men who have all the power pretty much can do whatever they want with impunity, right? So this is another layer of tragedy upon the horrific institution of slavery, was the rape of enslaved women by their so-called masters. And somehow even add insult to that, the frequent sale of children by the father. So, I mean, the psychology here is just amazing and troubling at the same time. So a man rapes an enslaved girl, young woman, who has his children, and then he ends up selling those children. I mean, they're his children. I mean, not that he, once in a while, the man would accept parental responsibilities, but probably pretty rare. Right? So what's going on here? What's going on here psychologically? We are seeing the invention of racism. How can you dehumanize another human? You consider them inhuman. You consider them inferior. So racism is being constructed. Racism is not natural. I suppose in an evolutionary sense, we kind of fear people who weren't from our clan, they look different, whatever. There's maybe some hardwiring in that. But this idea that people of a different skin tone are inferior, that's being invented at this time to justify profit, justify profit making. I'm just going to check my camera real quick while that soaks in. Right? So, if racism, and we're seeing that play out, in the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin right now, if racism is constructed, we put it together in our brain, we understand that historically, that gives us some tools to deconstruct it, right? To work toward anti-racism. Like, this just doesn't make sense, and it dates back to the freaking 1400s, right? Or maybe 1500s. Right? We can take history can give us some hope. The world's becoming a more interconnected place within a Western framework. At this time, we're talking now the 1500s. So there we go, some of the connections. Might be a little difficult to see. But here's Brazil, right? The Pope actually gets involved. He did not want the Spanish and the Portuguese to go to war with one another. The Portuguese are grabbing the coastline of Africa on the way to India, and the Spanish are grabbing the other stuff. And the Pope just draws a line on the map. He goes, okay, everything on the right side belongs, that's new, belongs to Portugal, and everything on the left side of this line here, Treaty of Tordesillas, belongs to the Spanish. Well, there it is, right, the tip of Brazil. And the Portuguese just grab it, okay? And the Spanish couldn't be everywhere. In fact, the Spanish aren't going to be too interested in North America. They're overextended. Spain wasn't a huge country. You can't have your soldiers and merchants and, plantation owners everywhere, right? So they largely did not see the value of North America and left it to the weaker and poorer English and French and Dutch. Magellan, sailing for Spain, circumnavigates the globe. Well, kind of. He died in the journey. 5 ships leave, was that Seville? Looks like. He dies there. He's killed in the Philippines by Filipinos. But nonetheless, the archipelago there is named after Philip, the King of Spain. Okay? I think 18 members of his crew finally make it back home in one ship. So it's going to be too expensive to go around the world, Spain. Okay? Oh my gosh, too expensive. This thing took 3 years. We only had 18 men out of close to 300 to return. We lost 4 ships. Just not going to make money by sailing from Spain to China. So, I guess we'll just make money in what I'll call the Americas. We'll make money in those colonies. So they're really going to focus on making money as the best they could in what we're calling the Americas. Okay? So we just said this: Portugal takes Brazil, the English, French, also the Dutch, not for long, focus up in the cold, especially like Eastern New York, Eastern Canada, of North America. Meanwhile, your book does an interesting thing here. The Russians are moving over land across Siberia. Okay, we'll see that in a map in a moment. So I think that's an important part of your book, is like the Russians don't have to get in boats. They're going over land into native societies and spreading disease, as well as their religion, right? Part of this movement among the Spanish, the Portuguese, and even the French was to proselytize, to preach the good news, right? To spread Catholic religion, the Catholic denomination of the Christian faith. The Russians will spread Orthodox Christianity. And that's not to let the English or the Dutch off the hook, like, well, they didn't really try to push religion. Well, in some ways they did, but in some sense, the version of Christianity the Dutch, the Calvinists had, and to some extent the English Puritans, the same thing, kind of didn't see the Indians as worthy of being converted. So don't bother, they're going to hell anyway. So not sure if that's better or worse. Okay. In the Eastern Hemisphere, trading posts are set up, especially in India. Why? For spices, right? It's that spice trade that's really desired in Europe. Europeans are becoming increasingly wealthy. How do you show off your wealth if you're a rich person? You become president, oh, whatever. The thing you could do back then is have your wealthy friends over and have spices on the table, because they don't. Have an enslaved servant who's of different skin tone. That means that he or she came from far away. Have like silk brocade, silk like wall hangings. Eventually have like beaver felt hats and beaver coats from North America. Stuff that was rare, that rich people like to show off to each other, right? So spices was actually a big deal. I know you and I are like, what? Who cares, right? But spices are so common to us. I'm going to flip through. You can read about the Dutch through the Indian Ocean, also in eastern New York, mainly for beaver pelts until the English at least took over. And the Dutch came to be ruled by the English in the 1640s. The Spanish will focus here in red. Well, at least they claim it. They don't really have much in Florida except for St. Augustine, kind of a fort in Florida. They claim this territory. They can't really hold it. Big gray spot is Portugal. And what else is it? They have the Philippines, right? So the Spanish take the Philippines. The Dutch are really going to focus in Indonesia. In fact, until the end of World War II, the Dutch hold on to Indonesia. The Russians moving across land. Let's go back a notch. Okay, in this direction, spreading disease and religion with them in return for fur, right? So fur coats, fur hats are the rage in Europe. The French, the Dutch, later on the English are after the fur in North America. The Russians are after it in Siberia, where you have cold temperatures and furry animals, right? The problem is that the Siberian people are going to suffer, right? Especially exploitation and disease. So how are they replaced, in a sense? They don't all die, right? As Native Americans people, they recover in time. But the Russian government starts to send poor people and convicts to this kind of barren Siberian land. Hey, go farm here. We don't want you in Western Russia anymore. Ultimately, and we'll pick up on this in a future lesson. Your book includes it, so I'm going to throw it in there. The Dutch will be replaced by the English government in what is now New York, or New Amsterdam as it was called, or this is Manhattan Island. But there'll be a major war between the French plus their Native American allies versus the English, who didn't have too many Native American allies except right, the Haudenosaunee, right, the Iroquois people. And there'd be a great war for empire worldwide, fought in North America, actually kind of in western Pennsylvania, places like Pittsburgh, Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, Lake Erie, Europe to some extent, where the Prussians with the P sided with the English, the coast of Africa, India. It's a world war. In this course we call it the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Usually in U.S. history courses it's called the French and Indian War. Okay? Because on the British side you had, the Americans, because really they were British, right? George Washington was a young guy wearing a red coat fighting the French and their Native American allies. As we know, who won that struggle? Right? Évidemment, c'est l'Angleterre, parce que nous ne parlons pas français ici. Yes, evidently it was English because we're not speaking French here. At least, I guess I just was. So the British